I'm gonna cut to the chase. There's a serious problem with Dark Souls 2 that I've never seen anybody address. It's driven me crazy ever since I first played the game, and for me, it's been a game-breaking flaw. But it's not adaptability, or hitboxes, or any of the generic complaints. Those issues aren't really that big of a deal to me. What I have minded, however, is how awkward the combat feels. Every time I play Dark Souls 2, I feel like I'm battling against the controls. My attacks all feel sluggish, and like the game isn't letting me do the things I'm trying to do. And I decided to do some tests to get a feel for exactly how the combat works in Dark Souls 2, so that I can figure out the exact source of what's wrong, why combat feels so unsatisfying, and like it's actively resisting what I'm attempting to do. In this video, I'm going to explain what is, for me, the fatal flaw in Dark Souls 2's combat, by first demonstrating what exactly the problem is, and then going in depth as to why it's a problem. So here it is. Dark Souls 2 has a huge problem with turning while attacking. To elaborate, first we need to back up. Let's look at Dark Souls 1. Dark Souls 1's combat is pretty straightforward, with some complexities that mostly relate to your build. There's a weak attack and a strong attack. The strong attack is not going to be a significant focus of this video, so instead we're going to look at the weak attack, which I'll call the R1 attack. In Dark Souls, you can one-hand or two-hand a weapon. These two stances have different attack animations. Some weapons can do combo attacks while others can't. For those that can do combo attacks, it might sometimes be advantageous to switch to two-handing for a slightly altered moveset. Not to mention, weapons that scale with strength get buffed by two-handing the weapon. When attacking in Dark Souls, each attack has 3 phases. There's the wind-up, the attack phase, and the cooldown. It's only during the attack phase that your character does any damage. During the wind-up phase, the player becomes restricted in their movement, but can still turn within a full 360 range of motion. This is true seemingly for all melee weapons. During the attack phase, the player can't control anything their character does. This remains true during the cooldown phase, and it's during the cooldown phase where they're most vulnerable to attack. Full movement and a full turning radius is restored basically on the exact frame when the cooldown phase is over. You can argue that when not attacking, the player is in a neutral phase or neutral state. To go back to neutral, you have to wait for the cooldown phase to end. But importantly, only during the cooldown phase can you buffer a second attack. Buffering a second attack during the cooldown phase results in a combo. Combos do not allow for a neutral phase of attack. Instead, the cooldown phase goes right into another wind-up phase for a second attack. Some attacks don't allow for combos, but can still be buffered in the same manner as a combo attack during the cooldown phase. The way to tell when an attack is a combo is when there's a unique animation for subsequent attacks. If your character is swinging overhanded and then switches to underhanded on the next attack, or swinging left and then swinging right, those are examples of combo attacks. Importantly, because you never enter the neutral phase, you can't voluntarily move your character during combos. But because the wind-up phase allows full 360-degree turning, you can voluntarily rotate your character. The result is that, with each swing in a combo, you can face in any direction you want so long as you turn during the wind-up phase. Since combos are a result of an attack buffer, you can buffer an attack, then turn while it's winding up fairly easily, being able to face any direction you want during each subsequent attack. Some weapons benefit hugely from this in some situations. Say you're facing 2 enemies that are on opposite sides of you, and you're using a dagger. If you swing your dagger to hit one enemy, then buffer a combo, you can easily 180 to hit the other enemy, potentially bouncing back and forth between the two of them, playing both offensively and defensively at the same time. Meanwhile, you might not get heavy use out of the full turning radius for a weapon like the Gargoyle Tail Axe, since it's one heavily committed swing even for a weak attack, with no unique combo animations. That said, the freedom of movement is still advantageous for the player because it allows the player to align themselves with an attack at any angle during the long wind-up phase so that they don't have to give a bigger window for enemies to close in on them. There's basically no downside to having a 360-degree turning radius during the wind-up to an attack, and many upsides to allowing it during weapons that have combos. So now, let's look at Dark Souls 2. For starters, Dark Souls 2 does not have full 360-degree movement in general, at least not when using the left stick in isolation. Movement is mapped to only 8 directions, the cardinal and ordinal directions, with dead zones everywhere else. This isn't really that significant of a problem, but it still contributes in a small way to the overall problem with attacking in Dark Souls 2. Just like the first game, Dark Souls 2 has a 3-phase attack, with the wind-up, attack, and cooldown phases all functioning fairly similarly to the first game. You can't move during the wind-up, but can turn. You can't move or turn during the attack, and you can't move or turn during the cooldown, but you can buffer an attack that will turn into a combo once the cooldown window stops. In order to be able to move freely, you need to wait for the return to a neutral state before you can start moving and turning to your heart's content. There are 2 major differences between Dark Souls 1 and 2 in this process. First is during the windup for any attack. During an attack, the initial windup, rather than allowing full 360-degree movement, or even the full 8-directional movement that Dark Souls 2 allows by default, the turn radius is context dependent. If you begin turning earlier in the windup, you can turn further, with the max turn radius seemingly being around 150 degrees or so. If, on the other hand, you turn later in the windup, the closer to the attack phase that your turning gets, the more reduced the degree of turning. If you attempt a 180 degree turn during the windup, you will get a max of about 150 degrees, and at minimum, you could end up turning as low as maybe 20 to 45 degrees. This is the first major change. The second major change happens during combos. The turning radius for combo attacks changes depending on what weapon type the player is using, or whether they're one-handing or two-handing a weapon. I used 2 methods of testing the turning radius during combos. First was to try to turn during each attack in a combo to face each cardinal direction in a circular motion. Second was to simply face in one direction, and then after the first attack, attempt to aim 180 degrees in the opposite direction, and see how long it takes for my character to face 180 degrees from her starting position, using a continuous combo attack. Some weapons during a combo have a turn radius limited to like 5 degrees per combo attack. Others will only allow about 45 degrees, and some will go to roughly 75 or 80 degrees. For some weapons, one-handing a weapon will have a better turn radius than two-handing weapons. The dagger, for example, goes down from about a 90-degree turn after 5 or 6 attacks to a 45-degree turn after 7 or 8 attacks when you switch from one-handing to two-handing. There seem to be no weapons where two-handing the weapon results in a better turn radius. This feels like it doesn't make sense. If anything, two-handing weapons should have a trade-off where being more vulnerable to attacks is the cost, and the benefit is increased mobility. But instead, one-handing a weapon is usually the superior option for turning radius during combos. Weapon types are significantly impacted by combos. Daggers have some of the worst turning abilities, only allowing the player to turn a max of about 90 degrees after 7 or 8 continuous combo attacks. Meanwhile, curved swords also struggle to get to 180 degrees of movement when two-handing. The weapons that seem to do best with turn radius are strength build weapons like hammers. Barely any weapons can manage a full 360 circle when attacking, and none allow the one-move full-range turning that we see in DS1. Instead, combos force players into a slow, gradual turn. This is most noticeable when using something like a rapier. The rapier's attack animations displace the player from the center position of the camera, and when attempting to do a combo of a full 360 degrees, instead of returning to center, the player instead forms an actual circle around their initial starting position, with some of the widest turning I've seen in any of the games. Contrast this to the use of rapiers in DS1, which, although similar with their animations, allow the player to instantly turn in whatever direction they choose, which easily allows players to recenter themselves rather than having to slowly spin in a circle to reach a potential target. The attack animations play a significant role in the issues in DS2. It's okay for an attack animation to slightly displace a player's position, that's to be expected. But without the ability to pivot to offset this animation, the player is committed to whatever direction and position a combo is going to place them. The player loses control of their character during combos in a manner that doesn't really make sense from a design perspective. Combos require far more commitment in DS2 than in any of the other games, which means you either have to adjust to the way they work in DS2 or find ways to work around the use of combos in some way. It also means that players have less control over their character and have to compensate by playing around the controls rather than with them. This is, for me, the game-breaking flaw of Dark Souls 2. We've identified what is going on mechanically, but there's probably plenty of people wondering why exactly this is such a big problem. So we're going to look at what consequences this mechanical change has, and why these consequences result in what is, to me, a tremendously unsatisfying gameplay experience. When fighting one enemy, be it a common enemy or a boss, combo attacks will come in handy quite often, especially to punish enemies by staggering or killing them before they can counter. When comboing, if an enemy changes positions, your chances of being able to hit them is lowered, requiring the player often to stop the combo, wait for the cooldown to reset to neutral, then reposition themselves to continue attacking. This can be very annoying when enemies can very easily end up slightly off from your intended trajectory. If you're locked onto the target, you're much likely going to be able to hit them with a combo initially, but the instant they get somewhere to the left or right of where you're aiming, you're going to have a significantly harder time hitting them even while remaining locked on, requiring the player to reset in order to keep attacking. This scenario where you're locked onto a single target is the absolute optimal scenario for combo attacks as far as likelihood of your attack going through. So if you're not locked on, then your initial attack could easily miss the target, which one would think is simply a skill problem on behalf of the player, but there will be times where enemies jump out of the way or where the dead zones in the controller mean that you'll be slightly off angle from where you would otherwise be intending to aim through no fault of your own. Now think about it this way. If the best case scenario against one enemy involves accuracy issues and difficulty being able to lay down a suppressive combo attack due to the baseline mechanics making it something you can't easily course correct, what happens when we increase the enemy amount? Dark Souls 2 is, more so than the first game, a game about crowd control. Being able to fight against several enemies at once, including sometimes several quite strong enemies, is a core part of the combat experience in DS2. And yet, the controls in DS2 are far less finely tuned for crowd control. I ran some tests to compare. What happens when dealing with groups? I tried to find an ideal scenario for testing the limitations of comboing in Dark Souls 2. I tried to find a location where I could fight two common enemies while standing between them, and see how much I could fend off against them when requiring a 180-degree turning radius in order to be able to actually fight. I did this in both Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 2. Dark Souls 1 went as well as you'd expect. Because I could turn 180 degrees during any attack in a combo, I could keep a combo going while pushing both enemies on opposite sides back. Keep in mind, this is at least New Game plus 5 and may even be plus 7, and I'm using plus 0 weapons against early game enemies. I do very little damage, but the ability to turn during combos does a lot to make the fight something I can manage. Now, in Dark Souls 2, I'm in New Game and I'm also using plus 0 weapons, this time against mid-game common enemies. Sadly, I couldn't think of a good open area to test it on, so I'm stuck in a smaller hallway spot. But still, with various weapons, positioning myself between the two enemies basically guaranteed I was going to perform poorly. I'm trying to use the same technique, switching between the two enemies mid-combo, but because of where they're positioned, I literally can't do it. One could easily see this as a skill issue, that I'm simply playing the game wrong. And in a sense, this is correct. This scenario, which is fully possible in Dark Souls 1, is basically a really bad idea in Dark Souls 2. You'll notice that when I do defeat these enemies in Dark Souls 2, the way it happens is usually by either repositioning so that the enemies are on the same side of me, or positioning them so that I'm really only fighting one of them at a time. This is why I did the comparison, to see what the meta of crowd control is in each game, and how it's shaped by the change in combo mechanics. In this situation, the natural process that I ended up doing to beat the smallest possible crowd of two enemies was to reposition myself so that I was working around the turn radius limitation. I was constantly trying to avoid the situation where I'm using combo attacks while in the midst of a crowded fight. Instead, turning it into a 1v1 by luring enemies away from each other, or funneling the crowd into a position that doesn't require me to think strategically about how I use combos, ends up becoming the best way of dealing with crowds. This is terrible game design. See, the Dark Souls 1 method, despite having more freedom, is also a more difficult skill to learn. Being able to be surrounded by enemies, all of which have their own unique AI and will attack at different times based on RNG, while accurately defending yourself, is actually fairly difficult. You're much more likely in this situation to take hits than to take out a whole crowd. The bigger the crowd gets, the more likely you are to get overwhelmed in this scenario, so it requires a decent amount of skill to brave it, to get stuck in a crowded area and actually fight your way out of it. Importantly, you can still do the DS2 method in DS1 if you want. You can lure enemies into a 1v1, or you can funnel the crowd into a location that trivializes the fight. But the most dangerous option, the high-risk, high-reward method of braving your way through a crowd that easily surrounds you, is only made possible by DS1's freedom of movement when it comes to attack animations and combos. It's easy to say that those who play DS2 like it's DS1 are playing the game wrong. But when the core combat design shapes the meta to favor the low-risk option, it makes combat really unsatisfying because it doesn't really feel like I pulled off fending for myself against the crowd. Instead, I just found a cheap way out of having to do it. And keep in mind, I try my best not to pick the cheapest option of just forcing enemies into 1v1s or trapping them around corners or in hallways. I do fall into the convenient habit from time to time in all of the Souls games, but I really enjoy the feeling of actually being in over my head, surrounded by enemies, and finding clever ways out. And I still do that in Dark Souls 2, but the clever way out is always working in spite of the core combat mechanics rather than through them. What I want is to be able to switch between defensive maneuvering and offensive maneuvering at a moment's notice, but what I'm left with is having to prioritize defensive maneuvering far more than offensive because of the game's inability to accommodate clever offensive play. One might think that the limited turning radius is more realistic than in other games in the franchise. This is A, not true, because the ability to turn in many directions is something that people can do even when wielding weapons. B, not well implemented, because if realism were the goal, then daggers should be the most mobile weapon instead of least, and two-handing should be more advantageous for mobility than one-handing. And C, not a valid argument in the first place, because realism is not a fundamentally virtuous design goal. See, if Dark Souls 2 were more realistic by having the attack animations be more of a commitment, it creates a disconnect between the player and the character. The most important aspect of realism in a game is to create an experience where the player feels like their actions make sense in the game world. This is why games often take shortcuts to achieve realism. Like, for example, when you reload weapons in shooter games, it's always quick and there's never any mistakes made or issues with getting the old clip out and the new clip in. This allows the game to feel realistic to the player without being technically more realistic than if reloading was more of a hassle. Games have to take these shortcuts in order to be fun, and the Souls franchise is no exception. Something like equip load is a form of realism that adds to the fun, but item burden, which is technically more realistic, is annoying for no good reason, hence why it was taken out of the franchise after Demon's Souls. The devs realized that just because it was more realistic technically, didn't mean it lended itself better to a gameplay experience. If Dark Souls 2's attack animations being more of a commitment is technically more realistic, it comes at the cost of the player feeling like they have control over the character's actions. If you're trying to turn and your character isn't turning, there should be a very intuitive reason why this is happening. If the reason it isn't happening is because your character is in the middle of a multi-attack combo, this creates a disconnect where the character is seemingly acting on their own. This means that throughout the game, in all of these subtle ways, the player will be losing control of their character on a frequent basis unless they avoid pressing R1 twice in quick succession. This is because, unless you wait to reset to neutral, you're going to be buffering attacks that result in combos whenever you want to do 2 melee attacks in a row. So unless you're proactively avoiding combos, combos are going to be one of the default methods of attack. This means that you're going to be battling not just against the enemies, but against the limited turning radius of each attack and the even more limited turning radius of combo attacks. You can get used to this, sure, but there's no reason you should have to. It doesn't contribute to the gameplay in any valuable way. If there was any intention behind it, it seems like it was as an anti-meta measure. It's possible that they thought that crowd control was too easy and they wanted to limit player movement to force the game to be quote-unquote harder. More likely, I think that the changes they made to attacking in DS2 was an early stage of refinement that they were eventually stuck with because of time constraints. But regardless, the problem is that they didn't actually make the game more of a challenge. They just prevented higher skilled players from being able to get full use out of that high skill. There are two major problems with this decision change as it pertains to DS2 specifically. The first is that enemy AI is significantly more advanced in DS2 compared to DS1. Common enemies are a lot harder, often having more ranged attack options, being able to close the gap between themselves and the player more quickly, and a general greater degree of ambush encounters that require the player to deal with lopsided situations that they initially weren't prepared for. This design would benefit greatly from DS1's freedom of movement, because the more challenging enemy types should ideally lead to more resourceful and skilled combat. But the limited mobility of combat in Dark Souls 2 means that the emphasis has changed from thinking more quickly on your feet to thinking more slowly and strategically about how to reduce the challenge. I think something that's likely common for first-time players of DS2 in more challenging areas is to farm out the common enemies until they reach the max number of kills for enemies to stop respawning. This should be the last method of dealing with enemies, not one of the most convenient ones. But the broken mechanics of DS2 made that the initial sensible option for me on my first playthrough, because crowd control just wasn't very effective when my character was constantly resisting my intended next action during tense, split-second decision-making that crowd control requires when playing more offensively. The second issue, and this is the bigger one, is that crowd control is the essence of DS2's design. DS2 would benefit so much from having more freedom of movement like in DS1 or DS3, because DS2 was built to make crowd control a major component of the experience. Crowd bosses become a major thing in DS2. Common areas are usually stacked with environmental challenges while facing larger groups of enemies and enemy types that are strategically placed to make the challenge of each crowd multifaceted. I'm actually generally pretty impressed with the level design and enemy placement in DS2, but it comes at the cost of being in the one game where quick combat is heavily discouraged by a broken core mechanic. There are times where slow and methodical play is clearly being discouraged. Black Gulch, for example, very much wants you to get through it quickly, and while this could easily involve just avoiding common enemies altogether, it's evidence that the game's design wasn't necessarily designed from the ground up for the slow, sluggish method of play that the combat mechanics require. This makes me think that the sluggish meta that Dark Souls 2 ended up with was an accident of design rather than strictly its intent. However, there may still be some intentionality to it, given that one of the recurring themes of the game is the player being faced not with many hard brick walls of progress like in DS1, but instead the long game of enduring a lot of smaller challenges that stack on top of one another. The gutter is a great example of this. It's an area that requires lighting a torch to progress, while also being a maze, while also fending off against several enemies, while also dealing with the poison statues. Passive damage is given far greater emphasis in DS2, where large portions of it are reminiscent of something like the Poison Swamp from Demon Souls or Blighttown in the first Dark Souls. It's the long, slow grind of DS2 that marks its basic theme of gameplay. Bosses are more about endurance than displays of great combat skill or strength. Areas are more about being gradually worn down, rather than sharply beaten down like in the case of a place like Sen's Fortress. It runs through a lot of DS2, and it makes me wonder if the sluggish combat mechanics were meant to further induce this feeling of enduring and being in it for the long haul. I can't conclude that it's intentional, but even if it were, it's ultimately totally unnecessary for the purpose of conveying this theme. After all, the Poison Swamp in Demon Souls also conveys this theme, while still having a full range of movement like in DS1. There are so many ways to portray the theme of having to persist in the face of an insurmountable challenge that doesn't require the core mechanics to be altered in such a way that makes the gameplay really unsatisfying and dull. I wish I could say that the problem here is that I'm bad at the game. I'm not a top tier player, but I never seriously struggled playing through the game. On my first playthrough, I beat most of the bosses within my first 2 or 3 attempts. Most common areas only really killed me when it was the result of an ambush or environmental design that effectively functioned as an ambush, like the poison vases in Earthen Peak that you don't expect to be poisonous at first. In spite of the game having at times more complex environmental design and enemy AI than the first game, it's also tremendously easier. Maybe the broken combat mechanics were meant to compensate for the game being easier overall. Maybe it was purely an oversight or an unfinished idea that had to make it to market because of time constraints. Either way, the root of the issue is that the way that combat works in Dark Souls 2 doesn't seem to cohere to the design of everything else. Apart from some maybe abstract sense of theming, the combat feels like it belongs to a different game than what Dark Souls 2 is. Dark Souls 2 feels designed to accommodate more control while giving the player less. Players can adapt to this. I eventually did myself, but unlike adapting to the Soulsborne style generally, which, when getting used to it, led to a really satisfying and cathartic experience, DS2 never clicks. It never becomes more satisfying, even as you learn the meta of how best to use melee weapons. Combat never becomes rewarding. I can't say for sure why the game was designed this way, but what I can say is that, all things considered, it doesn't work. It disconnects the player from their character, it shapes the meta to favor low-skilled play, it sacrifices realism, invalidates certain playstyles and devalues whole builds, weapon types, etc. It's one of those decisions that seems like an obvious mistake. Bloodborne, which was being developed at the same time, didn't have this design. Dark Souls 3 went back to how combat worked in Dark Souls 1. The thing is, I don't want DS2 to play like DS1. In many respects, I enjoy how different DS2 is. I enjoyed the Estus shard mechanic, the bonfire aesthetics. I literally even enjoyed the adaptability mechanic to some extent. The hitboxes are not a thing I've ever really cared about or took notice of. I should be a fan of DS2, because I like unique ideas and sequels that try something different. It should be right up my alley. The problem is that the core combat feels off. It feels off in the same way that tank controls on a human character feels off. It feels unfinished. Would the finished version work identically to DS1? Maybe not. I don't need it to. But I need it to work in a way that allows me a range of motion that is intuitive to what I'm trying to do when I execute combos. If I'm trying to hit 2 enemies that are within attacking distance but not positioned directly ahead of me, I need to be able to do so without having to end the combo to move them both into a position where I can start the combo over. I just need a design that allows me to act quickly on my feet while engaging actively in combat against several enemies at once. DS1 had that. Demon's Souls had that. It wasn't broken before, and they went and broke it in DS2. Could they have changed it in a way that wasn't broken? Absolutely, but that's just not what they did here. If you're a fan of DS2, I welcome your defense of this mechanical trait, but I want your defense to be why the way they designed combat in DS2 works, rather than why I'm bad at the game or why the other games in the franchise aren't perfect. I want an argument that actually defends the design of DS2. What good does this design serve? Now, this is just the one issue I've noticed about DS2 that I really wish I would see more people talking about. For me, it's game-breaking. But DS2 is one of the most fascinating games to me because it's a real close but no cigar situation. I think there's a lot it got right, but far more that it got wrong. Most of what I don't like about the game isn't the cliche criticisms, such as agility being attached to iframes, hitboxes being counterintuitive, etc. Instead, I think there's some deeper, more fundamental issues at play, with regards to the game's narrative, world building, themes, and yes, also more mechanical issues that I haven't covered. If you're interested in a thorough critique of Dark Souls 2 that looks at the good and the bad of it, let me know. I'm hesitant to do it because I'm not energized by making videos about art that I'm not a fan of, but I definitely have a lot of thoughts that might be worth exploring, since the flaws touch upon a lot of why I happen to really love the first game. On that front, I am working on a long-form video essay about Dark Souls 1, going into its existentialist and philosophical themes, and I definitely have a lot more videos I could make about FromSoft games, so if you have any interest in my thoughts on other FromSoft games or expanded thoughts on DS2, let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.